In this video, we're going to be talking about externalities. All right, externalities are costs and benefits that are felt by people outside of an exchange, right? An economic exchange. All right, so just as kind of a very kind of silly, kind of meaningless example. All right, let's say that there's two shops next to each other, right? Mind blowing. Let's say one of those shops is a bakery, and the other is a tannery, right? So in the bakery, you're trying to entice customers in, so hopefully the smell of freshly made bread, I guess. I don't know what else bakers make, cakes, presumably, any kind of baking stuff. But you're enticing them with the smell of these freshly baked items, right? But over in the tannery, they are just emitting some terrible smells, right? All the chemicals and all of the just kind of skin they've got laying around, not the most pleasant smelling thing, right? If those unpleasant smells from the tanning process waft over into the bakery, right, that's probably going to put some of the baker's customers off, right? So this would be an externality, right? This smell coming over, right, and running off the baker's customers, right? The baker is not involved in the exchange of leather goods, right? They are not in that market at all. They are not involved in it as a producer or a consumer, right? But they are still bearing some costs because that smell is wafting over and costing them some business. All right, so that's just kind of a silly example of a negative externality. Or an externality in general, a negative externality in specific. We'll get to that in just a moment. All right, so when we have goods that have externalities, right? So when we have a good that the production and consumption of which have these benefits or costs that are felt by people outside of the exchange, we can have what people will say is a inefficient level of production, right? Or an inefficient, that's the way to say it, an inefficient output level. All right, and the reason for this is because of the difference between private costs and social costs, right? So private costs Right, so private costs, these are costs paid for by consumers and producers. Social costs are costs that are paid for by everybody. Right, I guess probably applied is a better word, right? So a lot of these costs you're not actually paying something, you're just kind of, the cost is foisted upon you. Right, these costs, right, and of course that everyone is kind of not definite, right? So everyone could mean the people in your immediate area or literally everyone in the entire world, right? But there are differences between these costs, right? So the private costs, those are the ones that people use to make their own decisions, right? How much is this? And I guess actually at this point I'm going to point out. So I'm just defining costs and just costs, right? But these apply to benefits as well, right? Private benefits going to follow the same logic. Those are benefits that are reaped. Is that the past tense of reap? Anyway, it doesn't matter, right? The benefits that are gained by consumers or producers. Social benefits are benefits applied to everybody, right? So when we have differences between these two, right, we can not get to a socially optimal point, right? The reason for this is because individuals, right, if we're looking at the cost aspect, they are only going to consider their costs, right? They're not going to consider the costs of other people, right? And those are our external costs. So again, we're looking at it from the cost aspect, but the benefit side applies to this as well. Right, but these external costs are the costs paid for by people outside of the exchange. Right, so we kind of think we've got our private costs. Actually, just for ease, the ease of this. Right, let's say that I am in a two-person market, right? I'm the producer and guy B, I'll just use my dog's name, Balder. Balder is the producer, right? So I don't remember which one I said. I'm consumer, Balder's the producer. So if we are trading between the two of us, right, we are only going to take into account our private costs and benefits when making that exchange, right? Even though there may be some cost associated with that transaction that are felt by people outside of our transaction, right? So those are the external costs, right? So we're going to have our own private costs and benefits. We're also going to have some portion of the social costs and benefits included in our private, but anyone that's not involved in this exchange is going to be kind of left out of the kind of negotiation on what that productivity level is, right? What that level of output is, right? If there are external costs, right, then we might, decide on a level of output that's higher than society would want, right? If there are benefits, we might end up with a lower one, right? We're going to talk more about that later, but those external costs often are not going to go into people's thought process, right, when they're kind of deciding consumption and production levels. Right? It's not that we, as people, don't care about others, because that's obviously not true, right? There are a lot of people that care a lot for others, right? Not all of us, but some people do, right? And some people care to varying degrees. That's not the point. The point is that those external costs are spread so thin, right? So even if there's a hefty cost, right? Let's just say, talking about in America, right? Where let's say that there's something that's, I want to make it easy math for myself. Let's just do this. So there are, I think the last time I heard it was around 325 million people in the US. That was our population. Right, so if there was some transaction that had an external cost of $325 million, it's a very large cost, but once that's applied to everybody, it's just $1, right? And so that's going to be really hard for me to take into account when I say, well, you know, this stuff isn't that bad because I'm only getting affected $1 worth without kind of aggregating it, right? Or even you might just not notice it, right? If the cost of that action is so small, right, you probably aren't even going to notice it, right? But regardless, right, that is where those external costs come in. All right, now let's get a little bit more specific. Now there are two types of externalities. All right, you've already heard me mention one, maybe both of them. I can't remember what I've said so far. All right, that's probably not a good sign. But there are two types: negative externalities and positive externalities. So with our negative externalities, these are kind of when we have those external costs, all right? So goods that have external costs lead to negative externalities. A classic example of this is pollution. That's smoke coming out of the L's, pretending they're smokestacks. All right, but that is a classic example, right? So when you're producing a good, if the production of that good leads to pollution, right, then even though, you know, you're paying as a producer, you're paying the costs of, you know, for capital and for your labor, right? You're paying those costs. You are not bearing the full cost of that pollution, right? For that reason, right, when we look at the market for a good with these external costs, all right, and we're gonna just for simplicity's sake, let's say, all right, one example would be electricity produced by coal. All right, so electricity produced by coal definitely puts pollutants into the air, and so the market for electricity has negative externalities. All right, so when we are looking at the market for electricity, right, if left to our own devices, all right, the consumers and producers of electricity, they're going to take those private costs and private benefits into account when making their decision on how much to consume, right? So in that case, we're going to reach, right, the equilibrium that we are used to seeing, right? Where our supply and demand curves intersect, right? That's our equilibrium. We're gonna slightly change some terminology, right? We're gonna call this the market equilibrium for the time being, right? So here we have QM, that's the equilibrium quantity for the market, and then PM, that's the equilibrium price for the market. Now, when kind of we're left to our own devices, again, we make these decisions about consumption and production, right? And a lot of times we do not take those social costs into account, right? However, if we were to do that, it might look something like this. Right, so we know that when we increase the cost, or hopefully thinking back to, I think, chapter 4, right, when we increase the costs of production, right, we decrease supply, right, and that's essentially all that's happening here, right? We're trying to take it into account, those social costs, right, all those external costs that don't just apply to the parties involved in the exchange, and apply them to that production, right? And so we shift our curve to the left, right? We get this social cost curve. So we can kind of think this as a supply curve with internalized external costs, or internalized costs, you could say, right? So a couple of things that we're going to look at here. One, if we were to take our market quantity, right, our equilibrium quantity for the market, and we were to follow it up to our new supply curve, right, this would suggest, right, that the costs are much higher than when we were in our market, right? So here we're saying here's the cost of it, right? The price is the cost and the benefit of the last unit, right? So we've got it way down here, but if we were to take those social costs, right, and the original quantity we were consuming, right? I'm not going to write it up here because we need to write some other things, but it comes up here, right? That's a good bit higher, you know, and of course this is drawn, so the scale doesn't really matter, but it will be higher is the point, right? That the cost is higher than what we're currently setting it at. Right? So this is saying that the cost of all of these units, right, of electricity are higher, right, when we take those social costs into account. The cost of these units of electricity are higher than the benefit of having them, right? So it's more costly to consume and produce these units of electricity, right, than it is kind of when you take into account the benefit, right? The benefit gained is less than the cost. All right, so now let's actually kind of look at the next part, which is now we have a new equilibrium, right? We had our market equilibrium where our supply and demand curves intersected, but now we're going to look where our demand and social cost curves intersect to find this socially optimal level of output. All right, so at this new equilibrium, your book calls it an efficient equilibrium. We're not going to use those terms. We're going to say socially efficient equilibrium. So here we're going to have, no, that's not good. Well, we'll use their same notation just because QS is quantity supplied and I don't want us getting confused, right? But so this socially efficient equilibrium, right, here we see that we've got a decrease in the quantity, which is what you would want if you're looking at kind of this social surplus idea, right? You would want, because right here we don't want these units because they cost more than their value, right? The benefit is not as high as the cost, right? So we don't want those, right? And so we cut them out by looking at this social cost curves and taking those social costs into account. Right. Additionally, last thing on here, right? If we look right here, we already said that this stretch here, right, underlined in blue, those are units of our good, in this case, units of electricity that are not worth what they cost to produce, right? So this is also our deadweight loss. Right, in this context, our deadweight loss is I was just talking off screen on that. So the deadweight loss is the lost in surplus, right? Consumer and producer, so total surplus, right? Or as we're calling it in this section, social surplus, right? This is the loss in social surplus that we would have if we produced at the market equilibrium versus this socially socially efficient equilibrium, right? Because if we're producing here, again, this is the quantity, those are the true costs, right? And so here we are making a bunch of electricity, right? That's actually more costly when we take social costs into account than the benefit of having those units of electricity. All right, okay. So one last thing for our negative externalities for now. All right, we looked and we saw that if we get to this socially efficient equilibrium, right, if we can include these social costs into our calculation for our consumption and production levels, right, we're going to have a better outcome, right? We're going to have a higher total surplus, right? And that's what we kind of want, right? But how do we get to that socially efficient equilibrium, right? How do we take those social costs into effect, or how do we make people take them into effect? All right, one suggestion is what's known as a Pigouvian tax. All right, so Pigou, or I never remember how to pronounce his name. Pigou, whatever. I think it's Pigou. He is an economist, right? That's why it's called the Pigouvian tax. I believe French, but not that really has any bearing on this, right? But a Pigouvian tax is a tax on goods with external costs. All right, so it's nothing too crazy. All right, the idea here is that we want to decrease consumption, or we want to have a lower quantity of this good being produced and consumed than we do when we're at our market equilibrium. So, right, one way to do that, as we saw, kind of what we did, we added those costs and we shifted our supply curve to the left, right, decreasing supply. Well, the same thing happens when you tax production, right? So if we can apply a tax to these goods with external costs, right, we're going to decrease our supply, right, decrease the equilibrium quantity, and get to that socially efficient equilibrium, all right? The only problem with something like a Pigouvian tax is how much should the tax be, right? First, what is the socially efficient equilibrium, right? What are the social costs of this good being produced, right? This good with an external cost, right? Can you calculate that? And then if you can, how much, well, once you've done that, then you can apply that tax, right? Then determining how much of a tax we should place. Right? Now, if all of that sounded easy to you, right, then you should probably, if you're not an economics major, you should probably switch your major to econ, right? Because that's very difficult, right? It's a very difficult, be very hard to get that really even close, much less right on the money, right? Trying to calculate, I mean, you're only ever going to be able to estimate the social costs of, some good, right? Especially in a market that is constantly changing, right? So it'd be really difficult, really hard to do it, but that is one proposed idea, all right? And if you just want to cut down production of something, you can just tax it anyways and just be like, hope this is, at least making things better, right? That's probably not good advice, but, just shoot in the dark, you're gonna hit something eventually, I guess. All right, but that is our negative externalities. All right, let's now turn to positive externalities. So positive externalities, these are essentially the same thing as our negative externalities, just the opposite, right? So positive externalities, these occur when goods have external benefits. There are a couple of examples of these. Let me see, am I going to get the chance to talk about both of them? Probably not. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so I'll just mention both of them briefly. All right, so two good examples of things that have positive externalities are education and vaccines, right? For education, right, higher rates of education, so higher rates of percentage of the population that has education or certain levels of education. The higher that rate is, right, the more likely you are to see higher levels of economic development, right? Things like GDP, right, are going to be higher on average when you have a higher percentage of your population educated. Things like healthcare outcomes or health outcomes are higher, so you are less likely to have to go and use resources at your local hospital, right? And also generally, if you do have to, then you're more than likely going to have a higher income than average, right? And so you're more likely to be able to pay for those services, right? So lifting some weight off of the healthcare system, especially kind of the money or funds designated for kind of indigent care and those kinds of things, right? Also, higher education levels, higher rates of education tend to correlate with lower crime rates, right? So there are a lot of benefits that are social, right? A lot of social benefits to people getting an education, right? So when we have these external benefits, what ends up happening is that we are going to see fewer consumers kind of purchase education, right, than is socially optimal. Right? Because if we're, as a society, getting all of these benefits, then we want more people to be educated, right? But the person actually getting an education, they are only getting some of the benefits of getting that education, right? They are only getting the benefits for themselves personally, right? So higher, better job prospects, higher potential wages, so on and so forth, right? Which can be very, enticing, but there are also a lot of benefits that they're not getting, right? So they're not going to be willing to pay for, the lower crime rates that they're going to potentially see in the future, and the higher GDP that's going to occur partially from them taking classes, right? Because if you feel it at all, it's going to be in a very small way, right? That benefit is going to be very small because it's spread out over everybody. So, all right, the society may want us to have more people getting education and getting more of it, right, to get those social benefits. But as an individual consumer, right, it might not make sense for you to do that, right? Of course, everybody here is doing that, so that's very, very good. But a lot of people, there are some people that maybe would benefit, right, that aren't, okay? So that is where we see that positive externality, right? The other one, vaccines, I won't spend as much time on vaccines, but you get a benefit from being vaccinated, right? You're less likely to catch whatever it is you were vaccinated against, right? If it was flu, you're less likely to get the flu that year. If we're talking about kind of our MMR, those mumps, measles, and rubella? It's not rabies. Maybe it is. I don't know. But whatever that, those boosters. And then like meningitis, I think most schools require the MMR. And then if you go to a university, I think California might require it, the meningitis vaccination, or that just might be kind of schools where they have dormitories and whatnot. But regardless, you get that benefit of not catching that disease later on, but you also give other people benefits, right? If I get the flu shot, I'm less likely to give other people the flu because I'm less likely to get it, right? Also, herd immunity, right? If a large enough percentage of the population gets vaccinated against something, then it prevents those that can't get vaccinated for whatever reason from getting it, right? Anyways, all right. Your book kind of goes in a lot about the vaccines, especially the flu vaccine, and talking about that. But again, in the same case, there is a benefit privately, right? You get that benefit of not getting sick, but there are also other benefits that you don't get to take advantage of, so you might not be as likely to go get a vaccine, especially something like the flu vaccine, and you have to do it every year, you know, take time off of work, all right, go over there, wherever they're doing them, and get it again. All right, even though now, they're free. I'm pretty sure Publix sometimes will pay you to get a flu shot, right? Give you a gift card or something. All right, so, but still, you know, a lot of people don't get those vaccinations. All right, and again, that's because of the mismatch between those social benefits and private benefits. So now let's look at the model for these. Man, that's a really lumpy one. That's all right. All right, let's just, for ease of talking about this, let's say that we're looking at the market for vaccines. All right, so just like with our negative externality graph, here we're starting, right, vaccines, kind of the market, if we are left to our own devices, right, if we just let the market do what it does, right, then we're going to have our market equilibrium here where our supply and demand intersect. All right, so we've got a QM, PQ, PM, those are our equilibrium price and quantities, right? And when so these are just taking in private benefits into account, right? So if we have a good like vaccines, this is going to be completely dry, isn't it? Oh no, okay, good. All right, so when we have these goods like vaccines, as we've already discussed, we've got this external benefit, right? So a higher social benefit, right, to getting the vaccine. All right, and so we might see something like this, right, for our social benefit. Right, the benefit, the value we are getting from these vaccines, if we look at it as at a societal level, is higher, right? So we're going to shift our curve to the right, increasing demand, right? And we get a new equilibrium. Actually, before we do that, let's do what we did last time, right? So let's look at our market equilibrium quantity, right? If we follow that line up to our social benefit curve, right? So our demand with the social benefits taken into account, right? We can see that we hit the curve at a place that is much higher than the price we have here, right? So what this is telling us is that for this area, right, this section, and I'll go ahead and just underline that. So for this section of our curve, right, these units of vaccines, right, the benefit, right, is greater than the cost, right? And so we should be consuming those units, right? This is the deadweight loss when we're talking about goods with external benefits, right? So this deadweight loss is if we, well, I guess it's the same interpretation, right? If we were to consume at this market equilibrium, right, our deadweight loss would be this area, right? It would be the lost benefit that we could have gotten, right, if we took those social benefits into account. All right, but if we do that, we'll also get a new equilibrium. All right, so once again, this would be our socially efficient equilibrium, right, where we have PE and QE, right? So in this case, we wanted more of this product because there was more benefit to be had than the cost of the product, right? So by including those social benefits, right, we increase the quantity being supplied. So whether this is vaccines or education, we get more of whatever good we're looking at, right? And so we get to take advantage of all of those benefits that come with it. All right, so once again, we're going to pose a similar question as we did when we were finishing up with the negative externalities, and that is, well, how do we get there? All right. One of, I mean, similar to the externalities, one suggestion is probably not surprising, but a Pigouvian subsidy is a subsidy for goods with external benefits. Right. However, the same kind of problems that we had with the Pigouvian tax apply to the Pigouvian subsidy. Right. How do we gauge how much that social benefit is? Right. And how much should the subsidy be? Right. All right, potential solutions, but maybe there's some room for improvement. All right, in the next video, we're going to look at a couple of different solutions, both private and public, to the problem of externalities. I'll see you in the next video.